In 1961, a Soviet nuclear submarine came terrifyingly close to destroying itself. There was no American torpedo, no enemy aircraft, no missile attack. The threat came from inside the submarine itself. Deep beneath the North Atlantic, the reactor that was supposed to power one of the most powerful weapons ever built was beginning to overheat, and the crew had almost no way to stop it. K-19 was the Soviet Union's first nuclear-powered ballistic missile submarine, carrying 3 nuclear-armed ballistic missiles. It had been built to disappear beneath the ocean and remain hidden until the moment it was ordered to strike. But on July 4, 1961, the crew suddenly found themselves fighting a completely different kind of war. A pipe in the reactor's cooling system had failed. The temperature was rising. The normal cooling system was no longer doing its job. And if the reactor continued to heat up, the submarine could become a radioactive disaster in the middle of the Cold War. The men on board had one desperate option. They had to build an emergency cooling system themselves. The problem was that the only place where they could do it was inside the reactor compartment, a place where radiation was already becoming deadly. 8 men would eventually die from the radiation they received during the rescue. But the full story of what happened aboard K-19 remained hidden for decades. And the strangest part is that the submarine wasn't saved by its missiles, its technology, or some brilliant piece of equipment. It was saved by people who knew exactly what they were walking into. K-19 was never supposed to be an ordinary submarine. The Soviet Union and the United States were locked in a nuclear arms race, and both sides were desperately trying to build weapons that could survive a first strike and still retaliate. Nuclear submarines were perfect for that purpose. They could disappear beneath the ocean, travel enormous distances, and remain hidden from the enemy. A missile silo could be destroyed. An airfield could be bombed. But finding a submarine somewhere beneath thousands of square kilometers of ocean was an entirely different problem. The Soviet Union needed its own fleet of these weapons, and K-19 was supposed to be the beginning of that capability. It was the lead boat of the Project 658, or Hotel-class, ballistic missile submarines, and it carried 3 R-13 ballistic missiles. But K-19 was built under enormous pressure. The Soviet Navy wanted the submarine quickly because the strategic balance between the superpowers was changing rapidly. And when something is built for the first time, there is always a dangerous question nobody can fully answer. What happens when something goes wrong? With K-19, that question would receive its answer much sooner than anyone expected. The submarine had 2 nuclear reactors. Their job was simple in theory. The reactor generated heat. That heat was transferred to water. The water carried the heat away, allowing the propulsion system to produce the power needed to move the submarine. But there was one thing the reactor could not survive without: continuous cooling. If the coolant stopped circulating, the reactor would continue producing heat even after the nuclear reaction had been shut down. The crew could insert the control rods and stop the chain reaction, but that did not instantly make the reactor cold. The fuel remained extremely hot. That residual heat still had to go somewhere, and that meant the cooling system had to keep working. The problem with K-19 was that the primary cooling circuit had a vulnerability in a section that was extremely difficult to access. There was no simple backup system that the crew could activate and forget about the problem. If the primary circuit lost its ability to remove heat, the crew would have to find another way. Then came July 4, 1961. K-19 was operating in the North Atlantic during Soviet naval exercises. The submarine was underwater, far from home, and its crew was carrying out a mission that was supposed to demonstrate that this new weapon actually worked. At approximately 4:15 in the morning, the warning system suddenly activated. Pressure in the cooling system of one reactor had dropped dramatically. Something was wrong. Very wrong. The crew began checking the instruments and discovered that the reactor coolant system had developed a leak. The exact location of the leak was especially dangerous because it was in a section that could not simply be isolated. The pressure continued to fall. The circulation pumps were affected. The emergency protection system shut the reactor down, but that did not solve the real problem. The reactor still needed cooling. Now imagine being inside that submarine. You are hundreds of kilometers from the nearest safe harbor. You are surrounded by thousands of tons of ocean. There is no way to simply walk outside. And deep inside the submarine, a nuclear reactor is getting hotter. You cannot see the radiation. You cannot hear it. There is no dramatic explosion warning you that it is killing you. The instruments are telling you that something is wrong, and every passing minute makes the situation worse. The crew knew that if the temperature continued to rise, the reactor fuel could be severely damaged. A major reactor accident could contaminate the submarine and expose the crew to lethal radiation. In the middle of the Cold War, there was another terrifying possibility. A serious nuclear accident involving a Soviet strategic submarine could have consequences far beyond the men on board. Captain Nikolai Zateyev had to make a decision. The normal system could not solve the problem. Waiting was not an option. They needed to cool the reactor somehow. So the crew came up with an extraordinary solution. They would build a new emergency cooling line using materials already available aboard the submarine. They would essentially create a makeshift system to get water to the reactor and remove the heat. It sounds simple when you say it in one sentence. It was anything but simple in reality. The work had to be done near the reactor compartment, where radiation levels were becoming increasingly dangerous. There were no modern protective suits that could simply make the problem safe. The sailors had limited protection, and the equipment they needed was inside the very area they were trying to repair. Someone had to go in, and someone had to keep going back in. The first sailors entered the reactor compartment and began working. They cut piping. They prepared connections. They welded. They carried tools. They connected the emergency line. Then they came back out. Another man went in. Then another. The work had to continue because the reactor was not going to wait for them. The men were not standing in a clean engineering workshop with perfect lighting and unlimited time. They were working inside a damaged nuclear submarine, surrounded by heat, radioactive contamination, and dangerous gases. The radiation itself was invisible. There was no pain warning them when they had received too much. They simply had to keep working. One of the men involved in the emergency repair was Lieutenant Boris Korchalov, the commander of the reactor control group. He and the other sailors continued the work despite the growing danger. They knew that something was seriously wrong, but their mission was brutally simple: get water flowing again. Every connection mattered. Every weld mattered. Every second mattered. The improvised system was eventually completed. Water began moving through the new cooling route. The reactor started receiving the cooling it needed. The temperature stopped climbing toward catastrophe. The immediate crisis had been brought under control. K-19 had survived, but the men who saved it had paid a price that could not be reversed. The reactor compartment had exposed them to enormous doses of radiation. The danger did not end when the repair was finished. Radiation sickness began appearing among the crew. In total, 42 members of the crew received significant radiation exposure, and the radiation environment spread beyond the reactor compartment. The submarine had been saved, but it had become contaminated. Soviet vessels eventually arrived to help evacuate the crew, and K-19 was later towed back toward the Soviet Union. For some of the men, however, there was no rescue anymore. The 8 sailors who had received the most severe doses were taken for medical treatment. They were still alive. They could still speak. They had survived the accident itself. But radiation sickness is different from a normal injury. There is no wound you can simply close. The damage had already happened inside their bodies. Their cells had been exposed to radiation at levels they could not survive. One by one, the 8 men died in the days and weeks following the accident. Boris Korchalov died on July 10th. The other 7 followed over the next couple of weeks. 8 men. They had entered the reactor compartment because somebody had to. They did not go in because they were trying to become famous. They did not know that decades later people would make movies about K-19. They were trying to keep their submarine alive, and they succeeded. That is what makes the story so disturbing. The submarine survived. The reactor did not melt down. The crew was eventually evacuated. But the people who had physically stopped the disaster from happening were the ones who paid the highest price. And then came the silence. K-19 was a strategic nuclear weapons platform. The Soviet Union could not simply allow the details of a major reactor accident to become public. The submarine represented one of the most important pieces of the country's nuclear deterrent. Admitting how close it had come to disaster would expose weaknesses in a system that was supposed to demonstrate Soviet technological strength. The accident was therefore surrounded by secrecy. The crew was instructed to keep quiet, and information about the incident remained restricted for years. Think about the contradiction. K-19 had been built to carry nuclear weapons. Its missiles could threaten entire cities. Its mission was part of a strategy designed around the possibility of nuclear war. But when K-19 itself was dying, none of those weapons mattered. The missiles couldn't cool the reactor. The nuclear weapons couldn't repair the pipe. The Cold War strategy couldn't save the crew. People had to do it. 8 of those people would never return home. And the Soviet Union did not immediately turn them into the kind of public heroes the world might have expected. Their sacrifice remained buried beneath military secrecy. Even the families of those who died were affected by the secrecy surrounding the accident. Some of the men were buried in ways that reflected how sensitive the incident remained. But the story did not disappear forever. As information about the Soviet nuclear submarine program became more available, the story of K-19 slowly emerged. What became clear was that the crew had not simply survived an accident. They had prevented a much worse disaster by creating an emergency cooling system under conditions that were almost impossible to work in. The solution they created was so important that similar emergency cooling concepts were later incorporated into nuclear submarine designs. And K-19 itself continued to serve. The submarine was eventually repaired, and its reactors were replaced. It returned to service. But the name K-19 had already become associated with something far darker than Soviet technological power. It became a symbol of what could happen when an enormous technological system failed, and ordinary people had to compensate for it with their own bodies. The story became even more tragic because K-19 would suffer other serious accidents later in its life. In 1972, another accident aboard the submarine killed 28 sailors. The submarine survived that disaster too, was repaired again, and remained in service for years before eventually being decommissioned. But the accident of 1961 remains the one people remember, because it contains everything that made the Cold War so terrifying. A brand new machine, a nuclear reactor, a secret military mission, 2 superpowers watching each other, a failure that nobody expected, and a group of people suddenly forced to make an impossible choice: run away from the danger or walk directly toward it. The sailors of K-19 walked toward it. They entered a compartment where radiation was already spreading. They worked with limited protection. They built a cooling system from what they had. They did not know whether they would survive the next hour, let alone the next week, but they kept working until water was flowing again. And when the submarine was finally safe enough to survive, their part of the mission was over. Their lives weren't. Their deaths came afterward. That is the part of the story that is easy to forget when K-19 is reduced to a movie, a nickname, or a Cold War footnote. These were not characters. They were sailors. They had families. They had careers. They had lives outside that reactor compartment. And on July 4, 1961, they became the human barrier between a failing nuclear reactor and a catastrophe. The real lesson of K-19 is not that Soviet technology was good or bad. It is not even simply a story about nuclear weapons. It is a story about the hidden price of engineering under pressure. When nations race to build something first, they don't always know where the weaknesses are. When governments demand results, engineers sometimes have to work with incomplete information. And when the machine finally fails, there is often one last system that no blueprint can completely replace: the people operating it. K-19 was built to carry weapons capable of destroying cities. But when K-19 itself was in danger, the weapons were useless. The reactor was failing. The cooling system was gone. The submarine was filling with radiation, and 8 men went inside. They didn't defeat an enemy. They didn't fire a missile. They didn't win a battle. They simply stopped a reactor from becoming a catastrophe. And perhaps that is why their story is still remembered today. Because the most powerful machine in the submarine was not the reactor. It wasn't the missiles. It wasn't the steel hull. It was the people who were willing to sacrifice themselves when everything else had failed. K-19 was designed to survive a nuclear war. Instead, its first great battle was against itself. And it was won by 8 men who knew exactly where they were going and went in anyway. If you want more deep dives into the hidden failures, impossible engineering challenges, and human sacrifices behind the most extreme projects of the Cold War, subscribe and I'll see you in the next one.